Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Comics Lair. We're sponsored by Heroes Aren't Hard to Find and Heroes Convention. I'm your host, Nancy Northcott. This panel will discuss everyone's favorite web slinger, Peter Parker, aka Spider-Man, and his friends, allies, enemies, and loves. So with that, there is one spoiler alert. We are going to be talking about potentially the entire run of the Spider-Man comic book to date and all the movies and other media. So if you haven't seen everything you want to see and you don't want it spoiled, you might want to come back and watch this again when you're current. And on that note, we'll start with discussing Spider-Man in the comics first, since that's where he got his start. And then toward the end of the hour, we will move to movies and other media. And so I'd like to start by asking our panelists to introduce themselves and tell us how they became Spider-Man fans in the beginning. And Jack, will you start?
Sure. I'm Jack Cullen. I'm the author of the Recollections of a Rune Knight series. It's a urban fantasy series. Been a fan of Spider-Man. That's pretty much probably the first comic book I ever read. I had a little reprint book about this big that had the first 6 issues of Spider-Man, and I must have read that thing 1,000 times. To this date, my favorite character.
Okay, David?
My name is David Taylor II. I'm a writer. I write comic books, graphic novels, children's books, musicals, and music. I started reading Spider-Man when I was a child. My father would take me to the newsstand. So I had some issues from back then, but I was always amazed by everything that Spider-Man could do. And then him being a teenager, him having to deal with all that stuff in high school just fascinated me. So since I was a very little kid, I've always enjoyed Spider-Man.
Okay, Elektra?
I'm Elektra Hammond. I'm a writer and an editor. I'm going to have to admit that my mom was not big on superhero comics, so I didn't actually get to start reading them until I was in college. I was a big Spider-Man fan from the Spider-Man animated show, and Nicholas Hammond being Spider-Man live action on TV. And when I got into college and started reading superhero comic books like absolute crazy and joining my local comic book club, I was super lucky to have one of my local residents wrote the Spider-Man comic book, Roger Stern. So I became a huge Spider-Man fan right off the bat, because there he was.
Okay, Darryl?
Hey, Darryl Mansel, film critic with the North Carolina and Southeastern Film Critics Association. I'm much like David. For me, it was everything that Spider-Man could do. Like, he just had a whole bag and host of tricks and powers and things he could do. And as a kid, as a young X-Men fan, that fascinated me, because X-Men were like, you get this one and you got to do everything with the one. And then this guy came along, I found that he would do all sorts of things. So it was always fun watching that. And of course, one of the best rogues galleries there is. And that 94 animated cartoon is what really sucked me in.
Well, I probably have the least Spider-Man cred of anybody on this panel, because I didn't start reading any Marvel books until I was in my early 20s. And I think what I liked about Spider-Man was that the guy just couldn't seem to catch a break. I mean, things would go pretty well for him for a while, and then something would blow up and he would have to deal with it. And the thing that kept pulling me back is he always did. You know, he'd get knocked down, he'd get back up again, and he'd get back in the fight. So I had to go back and find ways to read the earlier Spider-Man issues that I had missed, because he's, I think, a really interesting and one of the more complex characters in comic books. Most comics fans know the story of Peter Parker being bitten by a radioactive spider and getting all sorts of unusual abilities as a result of that. But what some fans may not recall is that he didn't immediately decide to use his powers for good. And so let's talk about, do you think in terms of service to the character, do you think that was a good route to go or not? David, will you start?
Spider-Man, Peter Parker Spider-Man, was one of the first characters in the newly born Marvel era that made people come to grips with the moral and ethical implications of being a metahuman. With Superman, it was assumed Bruce Wayne created Batman out of his pain to fight the very thing that created him. But Peter Parker reacted like a normal person would. He wanted fame, he wanted money, he wanted girls, he wanted attention. And so his first adventure was him coming to grips with the idea, do I have a larger moral responsibility to the community around me to use my enhanced abilities in service, as opposed to just to my own ends. You can't blame a 15-year-old for thinking that way, because that's your world when you're 15. But he got pulled out of it in a tragic, unmistakable, change your life kind of way. And so it's what marks him as a character that's so different from so many other characters. So many other characters had somebody die and they retaliated, or they were created for war, or they are aliens and their biology creates their powers. Peter had an accident that took him into this whole new realm and didn't think he needed to be bothered with helping people, stopping crime, stopping thieves. And then that very decision cost him the most important man in his life. And so it's that type of scar, that type of weight that marks Peter Parker as unique. So the answer to your question is yes, it's brilliant, it's unique, it's unparalleled, unprecedented at the time. And you haven't really been able to duplicate that type of bittersweet, tragic drama origin where it's your fault. You lost the most important man in your life, and it's your fault for being callous and selfish. We're acting normally, but the price tag was really high. So yes, I think it's brilliant.
Okay, Elektra?
Pretty much what David said. The whole idea of Peter Parker as a completely normal teenager who acts just like an everyman, and that starts him on the journey of Spider-Man as he's just an everyday kid with everyday problems. And that the everydayness of the book is what made the book so popular. That he was a real human being with he had real problems. He had to deal with being bullied at school and not using his powers to retaliate. And he wanted to get the girl, but he was still that nerdy kid. It was all that kind of thing. But that origin story was just so stunningly powerful, yet so stunningly simple. It put it all in one package and delivered it up to you on a tray. With great power comes great responsibility.
Darryl?
Yeah, I think Spidey is one of the most relatable heroes there is, or is generally considered the most relatable hero there is, specifically due to that question, like that origin and what he chooses to do first is exactly what I'm doing first. If I find out I got some powers, hell yeah, I'll try to make a quick buck off of these powers. Why wouldn't I? Spider-Man at 15 is all the same motivations that me at 40 now has. Make a quick buck, see what you can do about getting the girl. It's something that we all have some commonality with as we struggle to try to make ends meet in whatever way we can. So it's always been one of the most believable origins due to the fact that responsibility had to be pressed upon Peter. And in order for that responsibility to be impressed upon that, you had to have a little irresponsibility to start out with in ground zero. And that's why the decision to not go straight into superhero mode makes perfect sense for this kid.
Jack?
Wow, those are some great answers. What I liked about it is, they hit it on the head. Absolutely. A kid would go out and do this, an adult would go up and do that. You get these powers, the first thing you're looking at is how can this benefit me? But prior to that, most of the superheroes at that time, with the exception of the Fantastic Four, was very two-dimensional. I have these powers, I must go fight crime. This was a very in-depth origin story where I screwed up, my uncle dies, his dying words, I use that as a credo for the rest of my life. It just made the character. And then, as they said, you add in that he goes out, he beats a hero, then he comes back, he gets yelled at for not taking out the garbage. He gets picked on for school because he's got to hide his powers. The girls don't like him. It was very relatable to a lot of the people reading the comics. Not everyone can relate to a billionaire who's got a cave under his mansion or somebody that comes from another planet that can fly. Everybody could relate to Peter Parker. That was the genius of that origin story in that character.
Well, listening to you all, I've just realized that this origin story actually tracks the hero's journey, because being bitten by the radioactive spider is the call to adventure, and choosing to focus on fame and girls and fun is the refusal of the call. And then the death of Uncle Ben is the penalty that the hero pays for the refusal of the call. That makes things worse. And I had never thought about it in those terms until I heard all of you talking about it that way. And yeah, I totally agree with you. It's a brilliant origin story. And I think anybody else who tried to do something like that would be hit with a comparison to, oh, you borrowed that from Spider-Man, because it's unique in comics as an origin story, as y'all have said. But I just realized that I left out the part where we start by asking you to introduce yourselves and tell people what you do and your interest. So this time when we go around, please tack that onto your answers. And my next question is, what do you see as Peter Parker's defining trait or his most outstanding traits, if you prefer the multiples? So first, please tell us a little bit about yourselves and then answer the question. I apologize for leaving that out earlier. Elektra, will you start?
I'm Elektra Hammond. I'm a writer. I'm an editor. I specialize in alternate history, speculative fiction, and pretty much anything you will pay me to write. I think that Peter Parker's defining characteristic is his perseverance. Peter can get pretty much down and out and have the crap beaten out of him, but that stubborn perseverance to get to the goal, to save whoever he's trying to save, to get to wherever he is trying to get to, is stunning given his powers. I mean, he does have some regenerative power. God, I cannot talk today. He can regenerate somewhat. He has solid healing abilities. He's got the webs. He can climb up the walls, but he is not Superman. He is not the Man of Steel by any means, and yet he never gives up, no matter what. You can toss bombs at him. You can smack him around pretty good. You can gang up on him, and he does not give up.
Okay. Darryl?
Darryl Mansel, film critic with North Carolina and Southeastern Film Critics Associations, as well as Bite Size Banner. Specializing mostly in genre movies, but I also like to get into the dramas and whatnot as well. And I think Elektra hit the nail on the head. I think you call it perseverance. I call it tenacity. It's his willingness to not stop until the mission is done, I think, is his defining trait. And for me, that's best exemplified in Avengers versus X-Men, where he's ganged up on by multiple superpowered people and he needs to buy time for other people to escape. And they just wail on him for pages and pages and pages. It is my favorite example of Spider-Man there is, but he does not quit the fight until he knows that his friends are safe. And I think that's his defining trait, is his unwillingness to give up until the job is done.
Jack?
Jack Cullen. I write the Recollections of a Rune Knight. It's an urban fantasy series about a hidden city of magic in the state of Massachusetts. And it's enforced by a police department that has to deal with spellcasters and supernatural creatures. I would say his greatest trait is his humanity. He's still a kid from New York with all those great powers, super strong, acrobatics. He's smart. He created his own web shooters. But he's never left his humanity. He takes care of his aunt, worries about his friends, his girlfriend, makes mistakes. But at the end of the day, always knows to do the right thing. With all his powers, he goes out of his way not to injure or kill the people he's fighting. He sympathizes and pities some of the people he's had to battle. The Lizard is a perfect example of that. Kurt Connors. I would say that's his greatest attribute, his humanity. He's never forgotten where he's from, and he uses that as a strength.
Okay. David?
Again, my name is David Taylor II. I'm a writer. I actually have at least 4 projects coming out this year. I got a group project, I got solo comic book, and I got an interlude and a sequel to my novel coming out. So I've been writing up a storm. What I like most about Peter is his creative genius. Okay. Many times that's downplayed. And it's not just the webbing. It's the one-way lenses in his eye slits. It's the spider signal in his belt. It's the webbing packets that he carries. And then also, if you know anything about Ditko's origin, he would have to turn the nozzle to change the web spray, which is how he gets lines versus nets versus other forms. And it's his ability to take what is now organic to him and add some technology and science to it, which actually completes the look and the hero. And he did all that himself at 15. That's what I like the most, that he had all that inside of him and that he was able to do that on his own. Now, you can make the argument when we get into Superior Spider-Man with Doc Ock that Doc takes it to a new level. He did a lot of things that Peter just didn't think of, not things that Peter couldn't do, but because Peter's not evil and mean and controlling, so he didn't do that. But still, that genius inside of that kid is still incredible.
Well, I have to agree with everything that all of you said. I mean, for me, because that's what drew me to the character in the first place, it's his persistence, that he just doesn't quit. And when Darryl was talking about Avengers versus X-Men, it called to mind that scene in Endgame when T'Challa throws the Infinity Gauntlet to Peter, and Peter is trying to get it to Scott so that they can use it in the time machine. And he's dodging all over the place. He's being thrown all over the place. He hitches a ride with Valkyrie. And then he's on the ground and Captain Marvel says, "Hey, Peter Parker, you got something for me?" And he's like, "Yeah, kind of." But, he just kept on going. He's like the, whatever watch it is, I don't know if we're supposed to mention the name, that talks about taking a licking and keeps on ticking. That's Peter. And one of the things I think we've touched on, but really haven't talked about in detail, is his supporting cast. And leaving love interests aside for the moment, who do you see as Peter's best friend and why? Darryl, will you start?
Aunt May is his best friend. I don't care what anybody says. She is, to this day, still, I think, Peter's #1 cheerleader. She's always going to be in Peter's corner as much as she's able. She has her questions of, where is her son during these times of horrible disasters and whatnot, but that's going to be the same question that any concerned aunt or parent or family member has. But I think that Aunt May is Peter's best friend, the best supporting castmate you could have. I think she is the one who keeps him grounded. Every once in a while when Peter loses his way, she's there to pull him back. And like I said, that is his #1 supporter, just in his life, even outside of her not knowing the whole Spider-Man business, just in his life in general. I think that is the best of his supporting cast.
Okay. Jack?
Oh, man, it's hard to beat that answer. I would agree with him, but since that answer's taken, I would have to say Mary Jane. I mean, he was friends with Harry, he's friends with Ned, he was friends with the Flash. But they came and they went. Mary Jane's been there a long time. She's been there, longer than, even as far back as when he was dating Gwen Stacy. And, they've had their ups and downs, but she's always had his best interests at heart, always. And regardless of how the relationship is, I would say that's the best friend.
David?
I have to agree with Darryl, but I actually think it's Ben and May. I think that everything May does is a flow from Uncle Ben, because Uncle Ben helped him to get to the point of at least planting the idea in his head of great power and great responsibility before he died, because that didn't come from nowhere. When you see that come out of somebody young, it's because your parents put it in you. Maybe you weren't ready to receive it or walk in it, but it's in there. That's Ben. So I'd have to say Ben as his father figure, and then Aunt May is kind of the overflow of that. But it's very similar to the situation with Kal-El and the Kents, meaning the impact they had on him is what shaped his worldview. And depending on which story of Superman's origin you take, sometimes they don't make it to adulthood. Sometimes Pa Kent dies. Sometimes they both die. Sometimes they're both there. But what's indisputable is that it's those values that shaped Clark to use his powers in service. That is absolutely true for Peter. It's the idea of, growing up the way he did. And they were still on very much the old school of you work hard, you work long, you retire together, you grow old together, you keep your family together, you enjoy each moment. That is a priceless upbringing, regardless of how much financial wealth you have. And Ben was able to get all that in Peter in 15 years, not even being his bio dad. So I have to say Ben.
Elektra?
Well, I've got to agree that Ben and May, for the most part, were steadying influences through all of Peter's life. And then there were friends at various times as he grew older and grew up. For one short period in his life, through, I don't know, a year's worth of issues, maybe, Felicia Hardy was not a good influence on him, but certainly was his confidant, his friend, his partner in crime, almost. And they had a interesting back and forth relationship that created a different dynamic in the comic books for, maybe close to 2 years. That was fun.
We know, listening to you all talk, and particularly what David said about going out to do the right thing, is not necessarily that something spontaneous, that it's in you because your parents put it there. And his reference to the Kents reminded me of the scene in Superman the movie when Clark, who's the manager of the football team, has stacked all the equipment and the players knock it over so he can't ride home with them and Lana. And then he races the car and he jumps across the railroad track, and we have that lovely cameo of Noel Neal sitting in the car. And then he goes up the driveway and he's so frustrated, and he's talking to his dad, and he says, if I get the ball, I can score a touchdown. Every time I can score a touchdown. And Jonathan says to him, son, you were put here for a purpose. I don't know what that purpose is, but it's not to score touchdowns. And then Jonathan Kent has a heart attack and collapses in the driveway. And I've remembered that scene all these years. And when you were talking about that, about the Kents, David, it reminded me of that, because I think parental relationships are so complex. And in some ways, they have a more lasting influence. And people who are lucky to be friends with their parents as the relationship evolves, I think that's really valuable. Anybody want to say anything else about this before we move on? Okay. Harry and Norman Osborn and the Green Goblin. I was trying to think this afternoon of any other superhero who has a relationship dynamic like that with people he knows becoming villains. I mean, yeah, you can say Clark Kent and Lex Luthor, but it's really not the same, especially if you go back to Lex's original origin story of losing his hair and hating Superboy forever, which, I mean, yeah, that's kind of shallow, but.
I understand him completely.
Right,
So, which Green Goblin do you prefer, and what do you think of that dynamic? Jack, I think we're back around to you.
I have to go with the original. Norman Osborn has had some, trials and tribulations with his history over the years. Spider-Man's been a long-running comic, but Norman's a classic. And what I mentioned earlier, he pities some of his villains. He just doesn't see him as, that's the bad guy, he has to go to jail. And Norman's a perfect example of that. He's mentally ill because of an experiment gone wrong. And Pete understands that and tried to take that into, you take that in hand while dealing with him, but that hasn't stopped Norman from doing some brutal stuff over the years. And it's a great dynamic. It's so much, so much more interesting than just simply put the bad guy in jail. And I mean, the whole Harry thing was an interesting twist. I got to go with Norman though. He's got the staying power.
Okay, David.
Well, you got to forgive me for getting triggered because the little trigger rants when they come out. I don't like any of them. They get on my nerves because the balance have shifted to where the villains can do anything and they never get their just desserts. Comic books used to be about, if you do wrong, there was a balance. There was someone there to stop you and you get some just desserts. But the Joker, the Green Goblin, Lex Luthor have all committed genocide, homicide, kill children, kill planets, and they just come back and they're laughing. So the whole thing about the Green Goblin pushes me out of enjoying it. And then he killed Gwen Stacy. I'm a strong Gwen. Anybody that follows me on Twitter knows I'm a strong Gwen Stacy fan. And I'm like, where is the answer? Where's the answer? So he just gets to wreck your life. And then all the stuff he did when he came back. And then that whole since past thing, he just gets to do all that. And there's no answer. You just suffer. Yet nope. So I don't like any of them at this point. I'm the kind of person where, once a villain like that has hit its peak, let the villain rest for a while, come up with some new stuff, or let the villain pay. Like they finally let Batgirl beat up the Joker. I forget which book it was in. It might have been in a Timverse animated series book. But they finally let Barbara wail on the Joker. Finally.
I think that was Birds of Prey.
Okay. Well, anyway, that's the least she deserved for all that he put her through. So that kind of stuff triggers me so deeply until it just pushes me out of it. So I'm like, nope. Tired of goblins, tired of a million of y'all. Everybody takes a formula, or you're super strong, or you got the pumping bombs, or you know a secret, or you just torment Peter. That worked with Venom the first time. Venom, that was a good idea. That worked there because since Peter was part of the symbiote, it didn't trigger his spider sense. I give you that one, that McFarlane's Venom was brilliant. But the Goblin stuff is so played out for me now until I'm like, nope, don't want to see him coming. Yep, nope. So don't like none of them. Sorry.
Well,
hey, yeah, go ahead, Jack.
I just want to put a counterpoint on that real quick. The thing with that, though, is, and I agree, I don't like seeing crimes go unpunished, things along those lines. But the problem is with Peter, that's part of his humanity is he's not the Punisher. He's not going to pull the trigger. He kind of leave it up to justice system, and that's what fails. And that's kind of what makes Peter Parker. So if you take that away from him, he's no longer the same character.
I agree, but I wasn't saying he should kill him. I wasn't saying he should do anything like that. There are other ways for just desserts, if you will, to be written into the story. They don't have to be by the hand of the hero. That's not what I was implying. But yeah.
Okay, Elektra.
I agree with David in that there should eventually be some kind of punishment in there, but I do love the Norman Osborn dynamic with Peter Parker and the idea that this is his ultimate nemesis. This is the guy who knows who his family is, who doesn't what's the right way to express this? Who doesn't play by the rules. He doesn't agree to we keep the family out of it part of things, or we don't go after the civilians in the conflict. He says, no, those rules are for sissies. I am going to go after your family. I'm going to go after your girlfriend. I'm going to do whatever I feel like. Those rules are for you good guys only. And the added issues with his mental illness or whatever that make it hard to punish him give all of these more interesting conflicts and convolutions in the book, because Spider-Man is never about easy stuff. If you want to read a book that's about easy answers, there are other books out there. Go read a Superman comic. I mean, Superman is all about the, villain of the week, and Superman is bigger and stronger than him and finds a way to beat him. And then it's a different kind of dynamic. Spider-Man is about issues in humanity and not having an easy answer.
Darryl?
I gotta disagree with David a little bit. I love villains that are slippery shits. They just never come to the justice. They always just duck out of some random back alley at the last moment and live to fight another day. Greasy villains are my favorite villains. Just, you can have all the information on the world on them and somehow they'll get out of it. And I love it every single time. Norman is my guy specifically for that reason. The waves were always wavy. I love that about him. He was a stylish dude. He's just a fun villain. And compared to other, each superhero kind of has their rogues gallery, right? If Electro pops up, he'll fight him for an arc and then, it'll be resolved. If Doc Ock pops up, he'll fight him for an arc and it'll never be resolved. Norman had the Avengers sweating at one point. Like he transcended just being a Spider-Man villain and became a Marvel problem with his Dark Avengers and all that kind of stuff he had going on. He's just one of the all-time great Marvel villains, I think. He might be my second favorite Marvel villain behind Doc Doom.
You know that scene in Breaking Bad where Jesse screams, "He can't keep getting away with this"? That's me a lot.
Well, one character who didn't get away with it was Dark Phoenix. And that was a heartbreaking story in a lot of ways, a beautifully written story. If I have to pick a Green Goblin, I'm going to pick Norman, just because the whole dynamic with Harry and Peter is just too heartbreaking for me. I don't like to go there. So I would go with Norman as the Green Goblin that I prefer. But I agree that there's too much in the comics in general of the bad guys never paying a price for what they do. And, when we were growing up as kids reading these books, the villain at least got hauled off to prison at the end. And, hauling out somebody off to Arkham Asylum these days is kind of like, here's the revolving door, feel free kind of thing. And so it is really frustrating from that standpoint. But I want to pick up on, Jack, go ahead.
Spider-Man was one of the very, 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 very few superheroes that ever got the Kingpin put in prison.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Daredevil never did he? Or did he?
As far as I know.
Yeah.
I'm thinking not. Even at the end of the Netflix show, I don't think the Kingpin went to prison. I think he and Daredevil just came to terms, kind of.
Yeah, he went to prison in the TV.
Oh, he did? Okay. And then there's the ending. Yeah, David.
Excuse me. To key on something that Elektra said, which I thought was incredible and on point, was that Spider-Man as a character is about messiness. It's about the messiness of life. And that is one of his fundamental vibes, tropes, tones. I agree with that completely. I'm saying I think there should be balance in the mess.
Right.
Not take away the mess.
Mm.
Because we've seen too many people in real life that have been doing like some heinous things for like years, but it always catches up with them at some point. It always, the house of cards comes down. And so that's what I mean when I say, you have to, and again, it's what Elektra said, you have to work harder as a writer to bring balance without ruining the hero. That's a huge writing challenge. And so if you were going to do something like that, I think that's a harder thing to do, but it can be done. For example, the old trope of the villain's powers end up eating them up from the inside and they die a painful death. The hero didn't kill him, but all that abusive power did something to him. The old trope of the villain finally finds something or somebody that he or she loves, and then they die because of their evil. The old trope of what they did with Hulk or what they had to do with Norman. You become such a problem until the other brilliant minds in the universe have to come up with a solution. Superman's catch-all solution has been overused, I agree, but something like the Phantom Zone. So they're not 100% solutions. Nothing's perfect, but there are ways without breaking the vibe of the hero to have, an answer be built in for what many villains have done.
Okay. Anybody else want to add anything before we move on? Okay, well, then I want to get back to something that David had mentioned with Venom. Because, for those of you who need a refresher on the plot line, Peter gets this really cool and awesome suit, and then he starts having strange symptoms, and the suit turns out not to be just a suit. So what did you all think of that storyline? And Elektra, does that mean you want to start?
Well, I at least want to point out that he gets that really cool, awesome suit because of the insane Secret Wars miniseries where a bunch of them all get pulled away into an alien planets and fun things. And there's a whole bunch of fun stuff that happens in Secret Wars. And I remember waiting for those issues to come out when it was running because it was just insane. And and then he came back with the new costume and everybody was like, why does he keep it? He had the old costume back when he was back on Earth. And then later, they built that up so beautifully and slowly with the costume started taking him out for runs in the night. It was just so marvelously slowly done and you didn't know what was going on. And then it turned out that the suit had a personality of its own. And then they brought out Venom. I thought that was a beautifully done storyline, and it was one I really enjoyed.
Okay. David?
Agree with everything she said, and also it was one of the few times that I bought, because one of my most hated tropes is superhero's lair gets invaded by the villain. because so many bad things, nothing good can happen from that point. And you have to do something cheesy to get them out of that knowledge. Once you know where the Batcave is, that kind of thing. But Venom was one of the few times because Peter had bonded with the suit. The suit was in love with Peter Parker. The suit knew his life as it was a living thing and they had become one. And then someone that hates Parker gets inside the suit. And now all of a sudden, everything that Peter did, Eddie knows, or Eddie as Venom knows. That's brilliant. And the idea that he could walk up to the front door and have a conversation with Mary Jane and Peter Spider-Sense wouldn't go off because the suit would no longer trip. See, stuff like that is incredible. That was just incredible. So early Venom I thought was great. And early Venom also was not, he didn't have that Wolverine level healing factor. He could be hurt and he wasn't omniscient, even though he knew everything about Peter. And see, that to me was almost a perfect creation of a nemesis, of a perfect mirror nemesis, someone that can do what you do, but, everything about them hates you. And so I just thought that was great. I think they took it a little too far with everybody and their mama is a symbiote now. I think, we should have stopped at Carnage, but that's neither here nor there. Venom in the origin and creation I thought was great. And I was, just to throw in a little movie stuff, I was quite disappointed that they got rid of all that for the movie because that's pretty much the heart of the character. And if you take away the origin of the suit and you take away Peter and Eddie's relationship and you take away all that early stuff, because the hero's always worrying about his or her family. So Superman told Lois for years, they can't know about me, they can't know about us, because as soon as they do, they're coming after you. When Peter unmasked in Civil War, first thing that happened, they come after Aunt May and Mary Jane. There's a reason for the secret identity, but when you have someone that won't even trigger your spider sense and is talking to your wife, having a pleasant conversation, and you can't even freak out because he'll kill her faster than you can move, or you might be the only thing on earth fast enough to come between him and Mary Jane. See, that's awesome. That's real tension. That's real danger. That's real dilemmas. That's the kind of stuff I like.
Darryl?
Yeah, to piggyback off of what David said, the trope I like the least in superheroes is that villain who is just a watery reflection of the hero. It was kind of like that MCU Phase 1 problem, like with Iron Man and Ironmonger and all that kind of stuff, Hulk and Abomination. But here, this is one of the few times that it is done amazingly well, from the design of the suit, all the way down to what the suit can do. I remember, as a youngin' back in those days, thinking that this is just the coolest stuff I'm reading right now. Like character development and all that aside, it's just cool to read and to see on the page and see how people like McFarlane were drawing the character, and just how they use Venom and how he just harassed and harried Spider-Man forever, it seems, which is always one of the fun things about it. I love Venom.
Okay. Anybody want to add anything before we move on? Jack, I'm sorry. I didn't come to you. I apologize.
That's okay. That's all right. No, I agree with David with it. Symbiotes everywhere. It's crazy. It might as well be clones. I said the C word. Sorry. Venom is a great character, but the original plot line was phenomenal. He gets it on the alien planet. He comes back. He's using it, and then when it's revealed, I remember, remember reading the final episode of that arc, where the Fantastic Four is helping him, and I felt bad for the suit. I did. It's like he bonds with this human on another planet, goes back to him, works with him, helps protect them, all this stuff. He's doing what symbiotes do, and then he's rejected. And I felt a little bad for the suit at the end of that story. But the best part of it was iconic Peter Parker. He goes through all this, and he's got to go home in a used Fantastic Four suit with a paper bag over his head. I mean, that's just Peter's luck, right? Great superhero, and this is how he schleps home. It was just so well done from the beginning all the way to that last scene. It was awesome.
In the PlayStation 4 Spider-Man, you can play as that Spider-Man with the paper bag over his head.
That's awesome. That's fantastic.
Well, since we've touched on Venom, who's your favorite Spider-Man villain and why? David, you want to start?
My favorite Spider-Man villain?
Yeah.
Oh, man, Spidey does have like the top two. He's neck and neck with Batman. I'm going to have to go with Electro. And the reason I like Electro is because that original costume is just so goofy and over the top. I love it. Number one. Number two, it's because he has an elemental power, and it's something that can give real trouble to someone with spider powers, because electricity is one of the few things. Because Spider-Man is faster than bullets at point blank range, but electricity is so fast until it's gone before you realize it came. By the time you realize lightning is struck, it's gone. And so having that type of elemental power would actually serve as a real challenge. And Max Dillon, the original Electro, is also, because all good villains are mirrors of the hero in some way. Every Batman villain mirrors a part of Batman. It's the most amazing thing. Every single one of them has one part of Batman that is their core. With Electro, it's the idea of, what if I get powers and I choose to commit crime? You got powers and you ended up fighting crime, but I'm just out here laughing with all this electricity and I'm getting rich. So what you gonna do about that? And so I like the simplicity of that idea, because just about every other villain is really, really good and has, a lot of layers and all that. But Electro is just really, and finally, he's one of the few villains that works at every stage of Spider-Man. Every incarnation of Spider-Man could fight Electro. That's not true for the entire Rogues Gallery. Some of them work better at certain stages than others. But I just love Electro for all those reasons. Hold on one second. I'll be right back. Hold on.
I don't think that means he actually wants us to wait for him. I think Elektra, why don't you pick up there?
Well, I'm a huge Doc Ock fan. I love that he is as smart as Peter, and given that he doesn't have actual superpowers, he uses the power of science to get done what he needs to get done. And I just love the battles between them. I think they're clever. I love the art on them. And he's since the very beginning, he's been one of my absolute favorites.
Okay. Darryl?
Yes, me and Elektra are siblings in villainy on this one. It is Doc Ock to me. As much as I love Norman as a Marvel level threat. But if you drill down just to Spider-Man, it is, I think, I feel like people kind of say that like his greatest nemesis is Green Goblin. I think it's Doc Ock, man. It is science versus science is what it comes down to. They are two sides of the same coin. Science used for good, science used for bad. And in different ways, the villains have forced Peter to become creative in some kind of way to defeat them. I think Doc Ock pushes him mentally the best in order to subdue whatever it is that he's doing. But yeah, for me, it's always going to be Doc Ock, especially seeing where Doc Ock takes us with the whole Superior run and him doing things that Peter never would have thought of, deploying his surveillance drones all around the city and things like that Peter had never thought to do. He was still analog out here, just patrolling, swinging from block to block. And Doc Ock's like, yeah, you're doing this all the wrong way. There's easier ways of canvassing your city for crime. So as good as a villain as Doc Ock was in his own way, he's an incredibly efficient superhero as well. And that's one of the very few characters, I think, in Spider-Man lore that you can really say that about.
Yeah, they actually did, with the Superior Spider-Man arc, they actually did Face Off with Peter and Octavius. The Nick Cage movie I'm talking about with Travolta, Face Off, that's what they did with Superior Spider-Man. Great.
Yep.
Jack?
Yeah, so Doc Ock, Hobgoblin, probably most iconic villain for him. And I love the fact that with Spider-Man, a couple of villains, you get Doc Ock, who's this pudgy, middle-aged guy, right? Who's like this incredibly, formidable villain. And then you also get the Vulture, who's like should be a nursing home, and he's flying through the sky beating Spider-Man up. You don't see that in a lot of the other comics. But you said favorite. And my favorite Spider-Man villain is Sandman. And the reason is because he's a very three-dimensional character. He was a bad guy before he ever had superpowers. He was a criminal. He escaped from prison, wound up a radioactive sand, got his power. But after getting kicked around by this superhero and that superhero, he rethinks what's going on, and he struggles to try to be a good guy. And he doesn't always succeed. He fails. He starts hanging out with the wrong people. He tries it again. He gets a foster daughter to trying to be on the right path. It's a great character. And okay, admittedly, Spider-Man, their first battle, he beat him with a vacuum cleaner. Okay, that that hurts a little bit. But his powers also have a tendency to be very, very powerful. A lot of the original writers really underplayed that, and the future writers down the road, they kind of picked up on that, on just how powerful that ability can be. And I just think it's a great villain.
Now, on villains, I'd like to also throw out that since we're on the topic, once again, what Elektra said, Spider-Man's about being messy. One of the best villains in Spider-Man's Rogues Gallery is Kirk Connors, the Lizard.
He was going to be my pick, actually.
Because he's...
Great character.
Yeah, because he's trying to grow his arm back. He's trying to become whole. He's trying to be a better father, a better husband, a better scientist. But then he ends up going through this transformation, this kind of Hulk out kind of thing. And so that's not quite the same as being evil. And so just wanted to throw that out as just another brilliant Spider-Man character.
Yeah, I would say that Doc Ock is probably overall the most versatile of Spider-Man's villains. But the one I like reading about is Kirk Connors, because he's got such an internal struggle. And he's another person who caught a bad break and hasn't quite been able to come back from it. So I really like reading about him. From there, why don't we do a quick discussion of what's your favorite Spider-Man arc? And actually, let's throw into it, what do you think about One More Day and One Moment in Time and Mysterio while we're at it? Because we're coming up on time, and I do want us to get to the movies too. Darryl, will you start?
Favorite Spider-Man arc for me, it's Spider-Verse. I think Spider-Verse is the most ambitious. It felt like a giant summer Marvel crossover that's not a giant summer Marvel crossover. It's just its own little corner of the universe. It's all this wild stuff happening. It kind of drops hints and ties to some of the larger things that are happening in Marvel overall. But Spider-Verse is, I think, single-handedly just the most ambitious that Dan Slott ever took the character. Bringing in this idea of spiders from all these different dimensions and going crazy with all the different types of spiders we get with the Indian Spider-Man and the punk rock Spider-Man and Spider Noir and all that kind of, the one where Ben was a spider, and just letting his imagination run wild with all the tie-ins that go with it. I know a lot of people complain about having to buy, all the tie-ins to get the full story. This is one of the times where I thought that the tie-ins overall enhanced the entire quality of the story. And, all told, is a giant stack of reading material, but it is so much fun to get through all the time. I love rereading it. I just reread it last year. As a matter of fact, I reread Dan Slott's entire run, and that's what I was looking forward to getting to with Spider-Verse. As far as One More Day, is One More Day where they wipe everybody's memory after the unmasking?
One More Day is where Mysterio agrees to save Aunt May's life, but Peter has to give up his relationship with him.
Mephisto.
Yeah, Mephisto. Yeah. Yeah. Oh boy. It's a story that was written by writers and illustrated by illustrators.
Okay. Okay. Jack?
I would have to say my favorite Spider-Man arc actually isn't his arc. I really liked the whole period where he was dating the Black Cat, because she wasn't a good guy, and they struggled in a relationship. And then she's trying to keep up with him, so she makes a deal with the Kingpin to get powers. And there's, obviously this is a catch, and how does it affect the relationship? And I like that whole arc because it was different than Gwen. It was different than MJ. This is a person that, stepped up in the battle and, was a little wilder and had a bad past. And I thought it was a good arc. That whole run where they were dating, I just loved it. The whole Mephisto. Okay, I get mad when he announced his identity. That annoyed me to no end. Because it's like, all right, bad things are going to happen to people you love, and bad things happen to people he loved. But I also thought that this was, I don't know, it was a cop-out, in my opinion. They hit a reset button. And one of the things at this point in Peter Parker's life was he was married to MJ. There was ups and downs. It caused trouble. It was a support system. It was very three-dimensional. And just wiping that off the board when you wiped everyone's memory, I didn't like it. And then you said Mysterio. Great character. Always loved it. I always thought the comics themselves didn't do it well enough until they did that Future comic where he basically just used Logan to take out the X-Men. Phenomenal. I mean, that was the best use of that character ever. I thought he was pretty good in the movie, but that was the best use of him ever. So yeah, I think I covered everything, right?
Yep. David?
My favorite arc, that's really hard. I would have to say the introduction of the Sinister Six. It's one of the few times where you have to admit, just from the original Ditko cover, that Spider-Man is so powerful, he can take on 6 villains at a time Remember, that's what Bane used to break Batman, was making him run a gauntlet until he was so worn out he couldn't fight anymore. And very rarely does Superman go with half a dozen of his villains at once. Maybe it's like Luthor and Brainiac. But Spider-Man is so powerful, so unstoppable, so resourceful, so tenacious, until 6 of y'all got to team up and you still can't beat him. So I love the introduction of the Sinister Six. It was such a glow up and an elevation for Spider-Man that sometimes I don't know if people always see it that way, but I see it that way. I'm like, wow, you're so incredible as a hero until half a dozen of your villains got to form a team to take on one of you, and they still can't beat you. In terms of One More Day, I need a new word for awful. I need it's just awful on every conceivable level. They didn't just lose their marriage; they lost a baby. She was pregnant. People always forget that part. And then it was so out of character until it's hard to read. Like, I haven't read it more than once because I can always tell how I feel about stuff if it has repeat playability for me. And I'm like, Peter would never do that. Peter wouldn't entertain it. Peter would find a way to fight his way out of it. He would have said, let me go get Doctor Strange, or let me go get Reed Richards, or let me go get somebody that knows how to deal on this type of metaphysical level, or Scarlet Witch, or somebody that I'm not used to, because I'm not doing that. I'm not sacrificing my aunt. I'm sure not sacrificing my wife, that kind of thing. And Mary Jane would never agree to it. Mary Jane is tough. Her first words were, face it, Tiger, you hit the jackpot. That's how we meet her. Okay? Mary Jane would not just lay down and let some Satan-esque character just take her life. Just no. So, no. If you want to have Peter perpetually young, that was the best part about the Ultimate Universe while it was still good. Just create another dimension where Peter's still a sophomore in high school and tell some stories we haven't seen before. But you don't have to destroy adult Peter and his family to make that happen. So, so there you have it.
Okay, Elektra?
I'm going to out myself here. My favorite arc is when Peter first marries MJ, and there's that beautiful tie-in at Shea Stadium when they got actors dressed up as Spider-Man and MJ, and Stan Lee married them. Wow. Sorry, I'm a huge Mets fan. Yeah, I know. I have now outed myself to all of you. Yes, we can. You've just got to remember that. Otherwise, I am not overly fond of, hey, let's just start all over and retcon things. That just sticks in my craw if writers can't find a way to write out of it better than that. Come on, we can do better. We are writers. We could tell them what to do. We could figure it out. Just stick us in a room for 5 minutes. We could give them 3 different versions that would work better than, hey, we'll just wipe out everybody's memories and start all over.
Well, my favorite era, it's not really so much an arc because it kind of goes on through other things, is when Peter and MJ were doing the friends to lovers thing. Because I think in addition to writing historical fantasy, I also write romance, and I read a lot of romance. And friends to lovers can be very difficult to do effectively, especially with a panel here and a panel there, and another panel over somewhere else, until it got to the point where it became the prominent story. And so I would pick that as my favorite arc. And I have to confess that I didn't read One More Day, although the lyrics are somewhat evocative of Les Mis, and I happen to like that show and the music. But I just thought, this is not going to be for me. I'm not going to, I'm not going there. So I have actually no opinion on that, but I will respect the opinions of those who have actually read it and have expressed them.
You're the smartest person in the room, Nancy.
Nancy, you remind me of a friend of mine who kept, I read his copy of the Dark Phoenix saga, which he kept separate from his other comic books because he just didn't want to deal with it. And he kept them because he had all his comic books in this huge pile in his closet in his dorm room. But those he kept separate because he just didn't want to like accidentally come across them and have to cry over Jean Grey yet again.
Yeah. Well, when that issue came out, that concluding issue to that arc, I was really hoping for a happy ending. I mean, yeah, I'm a sucker for a happy ending. I admit it. It's one reason I don't read a lot of mainstream fiction is that it tends not to have a happy ending. It's a mixed ending with happy elements a lot of times. And I just prefer my endings happy. But I went to the drugstore near my office on my lunch break and bought that comic and sat in my car and read it and wept. And I thought, I'm never reading this again. And I haven't. I mean, I thought it was beautifully written and brilliantly done and gorgeous art by John Byrne, but I'm not going there again. So since we are coming up on time, we haven't touched on the movies, the animation, or the gaming. I mean, really, we could do a whole other panel about that. In 61 years, Spider-Man has really gotten around. So let's start with a catch-all question about media adaptations. Let's start with which ones have you seen that you liked, and then we'll come back around the next round and we'll do which ones you didn't think worked so well, and then we'll wrap up. So, Jack, I think we're back to you. Media adaptations that you liked.
I like them all. All going all the way back to the TV series in the 70s where he's shooting clothesline rope out of his arm. I remember the days where you couldn't get a good movie based on comic books. Everything was based off of the Batman TV series. It was campy as possible. I think that they've gotten better and better and better, and I think this current Spider-Man, the last movie I thought was a little too, everything was squished together too much. They tried to pack too much into it. But I've been happy with all the movies. I love them. I think they're great. I think each actor we get's getting better and better as Peter Parker. They play different types of Peter Parkers. Thought they were all phenomenal.
Okay. David?
I have mixed feelings about all of them except the video games, and even there too. But if I have to pick one, I would say I would have to go with Spider-Man 2, Tobey Maguire, and Peter against Doc Ock. I actually think I think Molina's Ock is one of the top 3 best realized screen villains of all time. Book to screen translation. He actually elevates the character. Doc Ock becomes more interesting after you see Molina playing him, which is exceptional, but wonderful. And also, they had only one movie together, but I bought because all of Tobey's movies are about fathers. So Norman is a father in the first movie, and Doc Ock is the professor father, and Kirk Connors. All about the father-son dynamic with Peter. But Molina's Ock, before he went bad, understood Peter on a very fundamental level. And when you have a mentor like that, when you're the young person, you're looking at yourself in a couple of decades. When you're the older person, you're looking at yourself from a couple of decades ago, wishing that you knew then everything that you know now. And in a very few scenes, Ock was able to communicate all that to Peter, that his intelligence was a gift, and that he was brilliant but lazy, and that he needed to be better than he was. And this was before he became Doc Ock. So all of those inner dynamics I thought were incredible and elevated both of them. And how can I say this? Richard Donner's word was verisimilitude, meaning if such a thing could happen in real life, what would it look like? That movie is the closest Spider-Man experience to where if Spider-Man were real, I think it would look like that. So that's my favorite.
Elektra?
Well, I started with the cartoons, the original cartoons, probably, 70s maybe, and then Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, and which gave us the Dazzler, of all things, because she was unique to the animation before they brought her into the X-Men. And Nicholas Hammond in the live action TV. I have loved all of the live action movies. I've got a soft spot for Andrew Garfield as Spider-Man. I'm not quite sure why. I like something about his interpretation of Spidey, and I absolutely adore Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. I can keep watching that one forever.
Well, I discovered Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends when our son, who I'm not going to mention his name because then he would be very upset that I told the world about this, was interested in watching that cartoon. He loved it. And so I sat down and watched it with him. And I thought it was really charming. I had missed it the first time around, but I liked it a lot. Into the Spider-Verse, I really loved. And that's even though I watched it on an airplane with crappy sound. It's just, I persevered with the crappy sound because I was just so engaged by the story and the characters. It was so much fun. And I think probably my favorite Spider-Man is Tobey Maguire, but I think that's partly because I saw him first, aside from Nicholas Hammond, who I had forgotten about till you all started talking about him, but I thought he was really good as Peter. But in the movies, I tend to stick with what I liked first, like Star Trek, the original series, Star Wars, A New Hope. To me, that's always Star Wars #1. I don't care what they do with the numbering. So I think I'm sort of naturally inclined to gravitate toward Tobey Maguire, but I thought that Tom Holland was really good. And the scenes in Civil War when Spider-Man is fighting with the Avengers and he and Cap have that nice exchange about Brooklyn and Queens. It was Queens, right? I'm not spacing out. Yeah, thank you. I love that. So I thought those were all really good and I liked them a lot. And my only complaint is, and this is for all superhero movies, it's not Spider-Man, I'm really tired of origin stories. Most of the world knows who these people are. Let's just take them and do a story. Why don't we? And nobody seems to want to do that, but we could do a whole panel on that and I could do a whole rant on that. So I'm going to stop there and ask you all, which adaptations, was there anything about the media adaptations that didn't quite work for you? David, will you start?
You can't ask me what I hate without me mentioning Sins Past. So just have to throw Sins Past out there. It's the most awful thing I've ever seen in print. Okay, so to talk about the other media adaptations, I would have to say Tom, what's his last name? The news Holland. I keep trying to call him Hammond. That's Nick Hammond from the 70s. Holland was good when we first met him in Civil War. That was actually the best version of his Spidey that I liked. After that, he seemed to regress. He seemed to be less mature with each movie, which kind of confused me. The adaptations each show an aspect of Peter. We never get the full Peter Parker, just like we never get the full Batman and we never get the full Black Canary. So Tobey's Peter was about being a nerd. Andrew's Peter was about the weight of being Spider-Man when you're young. Holland's Peter is about being awkward in every possible way you can be all the time. And for that reason, he's my least favorite. Because I'm like, Peter's smarter than that. He's more competent than that. He can react better than that. He's not, like Jack mentioned, he eventually gets involved with Black Cat. He dates supermodels. He was invented. He's not that. So Tom Holland, I like the least because I'm just like, you're stumbly and bumbly all the time. How did you invent web fluid again? So no, don't like that.
Okay. Elektra?
Whoever made that decision to have the web fluid be organic. That was just, what? You are kidding me. No, he's a science guy. He created those web shooters. No, he's not like, no. I know spiders can do that, but they don't, not out of their legs, they don't. Sorry, that's always bugged me.
That's okay. Are you done or did you want to add something?
Oh, I'm done. That was my rant.
Okay. Darryl?
Adaptations I don't like: Amazing Spider-Man 2. That movie is not good. It's Sony trying to put the cart before the horse. It's them trying to build to their version of Avengers without laying the groundwork, in this case the Sinister Six, without laying the proper groundwork before they actually get there. And that is definitely seen in Spider-Man 2, where there's way too much time spent investigating this weird, mysterious past of Peter's parents and all this kind of good stuff, and shadowy figures we never see come into play. And then we have this whole underground tunnel where there's other things happening, and you see Vulture's wings, and you see Doc Ock's octopus arms and all this. None of that having anything to do with the actual story that you're telling at the moment, which that in itself was also not great. So yeah, I think Amazing Spider-Man 2, as far as adaptations, is the one that I just can't get behind.
Okay, Jack?
Well, I got to go with the organic web shooters. That is drove me nuts for years, but Electra covered it. So I'd also say the point where, and it's starting to merge all the movies in my head. I think it was the last of the original, where they basically just threw every supervillain, in a truck at the ending. I mean, Paul Giamatti showed up in a rhino suit, and it was too much. It hurt the plot overall. It just didn't work. I do want to throw something out in case I don't get a chance to later, since we're wrapping up. But J.K. Simmons as Jonah Jameson is awesome, so fantastic in every aspect. Knocked it out of the park.
Yeah, does anybody else want to address that before we move on?
I mean, yeah, knocked it out of the park.
I do have to add a tag onto what Darryl said, because I'd have to agree. I talked about Holland's characterization, but the actual movie, I've never watched Amazing Spider-Man 2 again. I agree with every single thing he said, but killing Gwen, I know she has to die. I know it's from the comics. I know it's a pivotal moment, but what they did with that movie was they sold us that romance so hard. They sold them as a couple so hard. They sold them as soulmates, whatever you want to say, so hard. And then that, everybody, when we walked out of the theater, everybody was really quiet with their heads down. We were stunned. We couldn't believe it. And even though we knew it was coming, and I've never watched that movie again, because regardless of what they think, nobody wants to watch Gwen die, especially not after spending 2 hours with them convincing each other that, yes, we're in love. We'll do whatever we need to do to be a couple. And then that happens.
I'll say that movie's not great, but that scene is, I've said it many times, as many movies as I saw in 2014, that scene is my favorite scene from any movie in that year. It's like they're showing this, the ratcheting of the stakes, and him trying to reach out to her, and the web that he shoots turning into a desperate hand to grab her. It's like they saved all of their magic for that one scene, and they spent all their capital on that one scene. Everything else, they're like, popsicle sticks, we'll figure it out.
Yeah. Well, the one thing that bothered me in the Spider-Man movies was the youthening of Aunt May. I think Marissa Tomei is a terrific actor. I thought she did a great job in the part. But one of the things to me that makes Aunt May an interesting character is that there are not many characters her age, and particularly not female characters in the comics, who play big roles in the lives of a hero. Martha Kent, who we were talking about earlier, would be an exception. But there are not very many characters like that. And so when they felt this compulsion in Civil War to youthen Aunt May, it was just kind of like, really? So I was kind of, I guess annoyed is probably the better word for that. And it has nothing to do with Tomei herself, because I really thought she did a good job, but nah, didn't work for me.
But Hot May doesn't work for you, huh?
Well, yeah, you could say.
And then she starts dating, and it gets really creepy. Didn't they start with Sally Field as Aunt May?
No, even before they had Rosemary Harris was Aunt May, and she was phenomenal. She looked just like Aunt May.
Yeah.
And Sally Field was Andrew Garfield's Aunt May.
Right. And I had a problem with that, because I'm like, Sally Field, I remember Sally Field from Gidget. I'm like, no. Oh, this is wrong.
Well, there is that. She's done a thing or two since Gidget, though.
Yeah, well, yeah, but when you're a teenager watching Return to Gidget. And then Marissa Tomei, it was like, no. Aunt May can't be roughly my age. There's a problem right there. But if you think about it, she's the one that's most realistically of the age level to be an aunt to Peter. As horrible as I'm saying that is to my head right now. So I'm going to stop, but it is.
Oh, also, I must mention that I'm the only person on earth that likes the organic web shooters. I love them. I became a convert as soon as, because that's always bothered me about Spider-Man. So I came up with a way, in-story way, for Peter to still create his web fluid and have those two. So it can work. So I definitely came up with a way, because the pushback I got when I first said that on Twitter, people just went crazy. How can you say that? And he's a genius and it destroys it. And they just went on and on. I was like, yep, I get all that, but I still like him because it doesn't make any sense. If you're gonna posit that you can combine DNA and only extract the powers of a spider that make you cool, not 6 arms, not 8 eyes, not all, just the things that would make you cool, there's absolutely no way you would not get spinnerets, and no, they don't have to come out your butt. And yes, there's a way to do both. But I've discovered that 98% of Spider-Man fans hate the organic web shooters. So I will stand by myself and say that I love organic web shooters. And I came up with a story way to also have Peter have the mechanical ones too.
I'll agree to disagree. We're allowed.
It did not bother me that
I know that eats people up. I know.
Well, that's one of the fun things about fandom is when people like different things and can agree to disagree instead of what a lot of people on Twitter do. It's like, no, I'm right. You're wrong. I'm going to keep up with this until you admit you are wrong. And it's like, oh my gosh, give me a break. At which point I block the conversation because I'm just done.
Yeah, Oscar disagrees with you, but
Well, as this seems like a good point to say, in 61 years, the debut in Amazing Fantasy number 15, August 1962. So it's really more like 60 years, but 60 years and a bit. Peter Parker's been through and done a lot. So before we wrap up, last question. Is there anything that you want to talk about that we haven't touched on yet?
The amazing art.
Okay. What do you like best about it?
It's brought to mind a number of really, really good artists. Specifically, Todd, somebody help me there. McFarlane really came into everybody's view and got really, really popular after doing the Venom stuff. And John Romita Jr. worked on it. And, originally it was Ditko, I think.
Yeah.
But there have been a huge number of artists that have worked on that. And Spider-Man is hard. With the original costume was difficult with all the spider lines. It is not an easy costume to draw. And the art on a lot of the books is just phenomenal. They are fun to look at. I dare you to tell me they're not. Go ahead.
Anybody want to add anything to that?
No one is drawing Spider-Man better than Todd McFarlane. The end.
Well, I think it's interesting that Ditko worked on both Spider-Man and the Creeper. And they have some similar postures and unusual ways they move. And I thought he did that really well without making it seem like he's just taking one and moving it into the other with different coloring and costume. I mean, I thought the beginning he did really well. Anything else anybody wants to talk about?
Yeah, there are two things very briefly, because I know we're out of time. First thing I want to talk about is I really like the webbing underneath the underarms. I love that look. I just think it's such an incredible touch. And the costume works with or without them. But I just love that, just to throw that out. And the second thing I want to talk about, which would be a whole nother panel if we went into it, is Slott did it. But there's this thing where writers take science-based characters and make them magic. And then they take magic-based characters and make them science. So for a while there, they took Peter away from the radioactive spider biting him as an accident and turned him into a spider totem. almost like Frank Miller did with Batman and the Giant Bat in the Cave. And they turned Peter's power much more mystical and much more magic-based. And then when you have Moreland, when you have characters from across dimensions that hate spider beings because of what they represent. So it gets into this whole metaphysical dimension of Spider-Man. So I'm not saying it was better. I just thought it was interesting to take a science-based character, introduce a magic totem as a source of their powers, and their accident was not accidental. They were chosen by a totem to carry those powers. And so it's a different dimension. You know, whether you like it or not, that's up to the individual reader. But I thought that's just really fascinating because, once again, it speaks to the versatility of Spider-Man, that you could make a case for him being bestowed powers by some type of spider entity.
Okay. Anybody else got anything?
Well, I think you should do a panel on, how to have a PhD or medical degree in New York in the Marvel Universe and not become a supervillain.
Or a superhero. I mean, there's
or superhero, yeah, because it seems like there's a lot of them.
Yeah. Well, all right. It looks like we've talked ourselves out, at least for right now. So let's go around and tell the people where they can find you and information about you. If you've got a recent or upcoming project you want to mention, please do that. And Darryl, we'll start with you.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at CDelicious, SEEDALICIOUS. You can find my reviews over on Paprika Reviews, like paprika with an O instead of an A.
Okay, Jack?
You can find me at my website, jackcullenwrites.com, and you can find me on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter at jackcullenbooks.com.
Okay. David?
You can find me on Twitter at DT2 Comics Chat. I have 4 projects coming out this year at least. I got one project called Blood World, where I'm part of 6 writers, where it's kind of like a heavy metal sci-fi anthology story. So I have a story in there. I've got a project, my Nephilim Wars series is finally going to be available to the public. That's coming out this year. I have an interlude coming out from my novel, Lucifer, Soldier, Serpents, and Sin, which shows the aftermath of what happens right after the big fight. And then I have the sequel to the novel coming out later on this year. So I will be advertising all that on Twitter. So follow me on Twitter and get the scoop.
Elektra?
Elektra Hammond. You can find me at untilmidnight.com or over on Mastodon at Elektra at Wandering Shop. And I just signed the contract on a story that's going to appear next January at ZNB Presents. And it's called Apart From That, Mrs. Lincoln. And I leave it to you to figure out what it is about.
Well, you can always find me here on ConTinual, usually in the comics Lair. I do have a website, nancynorthcott.com. And I have a Facebook page, but I'm not there much, although I do have a street team page, and we're going to do some interesting things in that coming up this year. And that's just Facebook, Nancy Northcott Street Team. And I spend probably more time than is good for me on Twitter. That's where I'm most active on social media. And on Twitter, I'm at Nancy Northcott. And I have coming out a Second Chance at Love story. Haven't settled on the actual final usable title yet, in the Caneham Castle Holiday Romance Anthologies. And the 3rd volume of my Boar King's Honor historical fantasy trilogy, it's a World War II story, will be coming out from Falstaff Books in the first part of the year. So that's it. I'd like to thank everybody for participating on the panel. It's been great. Thanks also to our sponsors, Heroes Aren't Hard to Find and Heroes Convention. And you can find more information about them at Heroes Online. And finally, and certainly not least, thank you to everybody who has watched this panel.